Chapter 1. Friday afternoon. Friday afternoon. It was always the same. Marco was on the farm as usual. It was hot. Too hot for work. "Get up!" shouted a voice. Marco looked up at his father. "Get up!" said his father again. "Look at those trees. They're full of peaches." Marco didn't answer. He got up slowly and picked the peaches one by one. "It's always the same," his father thought. "Marco doesn't like work." "It's always the same," thought Marco. "Nothing but work." At 3 o'clock, it was too hot to work. The men on the farm rested. They smoked and talked. Then they lay on the ground and slept. But Marco and his father were busy. There was still a lot to do. Marco had to count the boxes of peaches. 239, 240. It's not bad," said his father. "The peaches are good this year. We'll make a lot of money." Marco did not listen. He wasn't interested. He never talked much with his father. They worked together, but they weren't friends. Soon a lorry arrived. Marco's father called the men. "Another hour," he told them. "Then we finish." The men were busy again. Marco helped them. They put labels on the boxes. Then they put the boxes onto the lorry. The week's work was nearly over. Marco's father watched the men and smiled. But Marco didn't smile. Carlo, the driver of the lorry, signed a piece of paper. Then he shook hands with Marco's father. Carlo was taking the peaches to the city. He was going to sell them in the market. Marco went inside the farmhouse. His mother was cooking a meal. It was spaghetti. Friday night was always spaghetti. Marco wasn't hungry. It was cool inside the house. Marco stood at the window and watched the lorry move away. "Tomorrow is Saturday," he thought. "What can I do at the weekend? There's nothing to do here." Then he had an idea. There was a train to the city every Saturday. It left early in the morning. "I'll get on the train and go to the city tomorrow," thought Marco. "I'll leave the farm early. Nobody will know." Chapter 2. Saturday morning. The next morning, Marco got up early. It was 5 o'clock. His father and mother were asleep. He didn't wake them. He took a pair of jeans and a shirt and put them in a bag. And a little money. It was enough. Then he left the farm quietly. It was a long walk to the village. The sun was still low and not too hot. Marco carried the bag over his shoulder and walked quickly. He didn't want to meet anybody on the road. In half an hour, he was in the village. It was empty. The village was always empty. Marco wanted to shout. He wanted to wake everybody up. He wanted to hear the noise of people and cars. Everything in the village was always too quiet. Marco arrived at the station and looked down the platform. One person was waiting. He looked down the railway line. There was no train. He waited in silence. Soon, a man arrived on the platform. Marco knew him. The man sold tickets for the train. Marco didn't want to buy a ticket. He didn't have enough money. He hid behind a fence at the end of the platform and waited. At last, the train came into the station. 1 or 2 people got off. Then a whistle blew. The train was leaving. Marco didn't wait any longer. He put his hands on the fence and jumped. He landed on the platform and ran along it. He opened one of the train doors and jumped. Nobody had noticed him. He was safe. Marco quickly closed the door and sat down. The train stopped at lots of stations. Marco fell asleep. The train stopped again. Marco awoke. There was a woman next to him.
"Here we are," she said. "This is the big city."
"Already?" asked Marco, and he looked out of the window. They were in a large station. The platform was full of people. Marco got out of the train and walked quickly down the platform. Then he stopped suddenly. The passengers were giving their tickets to a man. Marco didn't move. He didn't have a ticket.
"Tickets, please." "Come here." "Wait!"
Marco didn't wait. He dropped his bag and ran. Marco ran out of the station and turned into a narrow street. There was nobody behind him. He felt hot and tired, and he felt frightened. He stood against a wall and looked around him. The buildings were tall and dirty. The street was dirty too. There was a cafe over the road, but it was closed. Then Marco remembered something. Most of his money was in his bag. The bag was at the station. Now he was in a strange city, and he had very little money. Chapter 3. Saturday midday. Marco walked down the narrow street. He came into a long, wide road. On one corner there was a large shop. The shop sold bread and cakes. Marco stood at the window and looked inside. The cakes were beautiful. Marco felt hungry. A girl was standing next to Marco. She had blonde hair, and she looked about 18. The girl looked at Marco and smiled. "Hello," she said. She was pretty, but she looked very dirty. She was wearing old jeans and a pair of boots. Her eyes were green. Marco liked girls with green eyes. Marco looked at the girl. "You're not very happy," she said. "What's the matter?" "Nothing," replied Marco. He looked again at the cakes inside the shop. He was afraid of large shops. There were no large shops in his village. "I'm hungry," the girl said suddenly. "Let's share a cake. We can eat it together." "Okay," said Marco. "That's a great idea." "I know the woman in this shop," said the girl. "She'll give me a cake cheaply. But I haven't got any money." "Have you any money?" "Not much." "How much?" "Okay, that's enough. You wait outside." Marco gave the girl his money. She took it and went into the shop. Marco waited outside the shop. He looked down the street and watched the people on the pavement. He looked up at the grey sky. A minute passed. Then Marco looked into the shop again. The cake was not in the window now. The shop had 2 doors. The large door opened into the road. A side door opened into a narrow street. Marco looked carefully through the window. The girl was going through the side door in a hurry. She was carrying a large cake. Marco left the front of the shop. He ran to the corner and looked down the narrow street. The girl was running down the street. She was running away from Marco. Marco was not frightened now. He felt angry. "Stop!" he shouted. But the girl did not stop. She kept running, and Marco followed her. Marco ran faster than the girl. She looked round, and Marco was only a few meters behind. The girl ran between two cars and out into the street. She did not see the police car. It was coming slowly down the narrow street towards her. Suddenly, she tripped and fell. The police car stopped in front of her. Marco followed the girl into the street and stopped. He was breathing heavily. The girl was lying on the ground. There was some blood on her arm, but she was not badly hurt. The cake lay next to her. It was broken in pieces. The girl looked up at Marco. "Leave me alone," she said. Marco stood still. "You can keep my cake," he told her. "I don't want it. You can have it." Marco turned away. Then he heard a voice behind him. A policeman was coming towards him. "What's going on?" "She stole my money." "Is that true?" "No. He was following me." The policeman believed the girl. He looked at Marco in silence. He did not believe Marco. "Do you live here?" No. I'm here on holiday." "Well, go home and leave our girls alone." "Okay, I'm going." The policeman looked at the girl and smiled. The girl looked up at Marco. Marco did not smile. He turned and walked away down the street. Chapter 4. Saturday afternoon. Marco walked for a long time. He looked into the windows of the shops. They were full of beautiful things. But Marco had no more money. What can I do now? He thought quickly. The market! I can go there. Every city has a market. He left the shops and looked for the market. Perhaps somebody can help me, he thought. But the people in the streets looked unfriendly. Marco didn't speak to them. He walked and walked. At last, he found the market in a large square. There were long wooden tables in the square. There were fruit, vegetables, fish and flowers on the tables. Marco stopped next to one of the tables. There were some boxes of peaches on the ground. On one box there was a label with writing on it. It was Marco's writing. Marco smiled. These were his peaches, from his father's farm. Marco took a peach from one of the boxes. He did not see the large man beside him. The man was wearing a small hat. He was watching Marco. "What do you want?" "A peach. I'm hungry." "I want the money first." "They're my peaches." Marco wanted to run away, but there was no escape. A lot of people were watching him, and they all looked unfriendly. Marco hated the city. They're my peaches, Marco said again loudly. They're from my father's farm. I won't pay you any money. The man raised his hand. He was going to hit Marco. But then he heard a voice behind him and stopped. Marco looked round into a crowd of people. He knew that voice. He didn't believe it. Carlo was coming towards him. Carlo had driven the lorry from the farm and brought the peaches into the city. "This is Marco from the farm," said Carlo. "Leave him alone." The large man wiped his hands on his shirt and shook his head. "Oh, it's you," he said to Marco. "Why didn't you tell me? I know your father. Here, have another peach." Marco ate the peaches slowly. They tasted good. "You want another?" asked Carlo. Marco nodded and smiled. "What are you doing here?" asked Carlo. "It's a long story," replied Marco. Marco and Carlo sat next to the lorry and they talked. Marco told Carlo everything. "And when are you leaving?" asked Carlo. Marco wasn't listening. He was looking at the streets and the people in the market. Nothing was clean. Everything was dirty. "I'm driving back to the village tonight," said Carlo. "It's a long way. Do you want to come with me?" Marco looked at Carlo and nodded. He didn't like the city. He had seen enough. Now he was going home with Carlo. Chapter 5. Saturday evening. The lorry left at 6:30. It was raining now, and the roads were wet. Carlo drove, and Marco sat next to him. They left the market and drove past the shops. They passed the station. The station! Marco's bag was in the station. Soon they left the city. The roads became wider, and the lorry went faster. There were fields on each side of the road. Marco felt better. He closed his eyes and listened to the noise of the lorry. It was hot inside the lorry, and there was a strong smell of peaches. It was a good smell. Marco felt hungry and tired. In a few minutes, he was asleep. He awoke much later. "You'll be home in a few minutes," said Carlo. Marco looked out of the window. It was not raining now, and the moon was shining. Marco knew the road. His farm was a few kilometers away. The lorry stopped. Marco thanked Carlo and got out. "I'll see you next Friday," called Carlo, and he drove away. Marco walked up the path to the farmhouse. The house seemed very quiet. "My father is asleep," thought Marco. "That's good. Tomorrow is Sunday. I'll do nothing. That will be nice." The front door was open. Marco went inside and turned on a light. Everything was the same. It was quiet. Too quiet. "Marco, is that you?" The voice came from the top of the stairs. Marco turned suddenly towards the door. For a moment, he wanted to escape. Then he thought again. Carlo had left. There was nowhere to go. He looked up the empty stairs and heard the voice again. "Yes, Dad, it's me," he called. "I'm coming up."